Hey everybody, welcome to CodePen Radio number 332. This is going to be a CodePen Radio on the TV. So either there's a video version that you can watch right in your podcast player, or maybe it's an audio version. I don't know. I'm just recording it right now. You're listening in the future. That's amazing.
Or watching.
But there definitely will be a video component to this because we're going to show you some stuff, but hopefully we can talk through it nicely too. We're going to be talking about server-side rendering, a concept in web development, which just means that like you went the extra mile, and even though you're architecting your app in client-side like technology, that you've also made sure that it's going to render on the server side as well. So here to talk with me about that and really educate me on how we're doing it at CodePen, or are going to be doing it in the future, is Mr. Stephen Shaw. Hey, Stephen.
Hello, everybody.
Yeah, man. So we, last week, I guess, on this very podcast, I talked with Marie about our new CP admin tools, like behind the scenes tooling to improve, what we do for customer support and all that. And there was a lot of story to that because yes, we want new admin tooling. Admin tooling is great. It improves what we're able to do for you, and it makes it satisfying to do tasks that you need to do as an employee here at CodePen. But the real story was that there's more to it than that. We are trying to prove out some new technology for CodePen that we can like evolve into and take advantage of for new areas of CodePen. And that was Next.js, and that we're going to plan to use that because it's such a nice React framework for authors, and then has SSR built into it. Again, that's server-side rendering. It's possible to bring that to the party. So if we needed to prove out, hey, if we're really going to use this for CodePen, it has to have that, because some areas of the site are so vital for SEO and speed and all that. So that was a kind of on the requirements list, which is one of the reasons we are chasing down Next.js. Now we're shipping a real product in it. It is only admin tools, but all of that was built in Next.js. And then towards the end of that process, Stephen was like, I'll continue to use it as a playground for SSR, right? So let's see. Let me kick your screen onto the old video stream here so people can look at what I'm talking about. Next.js, Vercel's framework for React, and then what's going on the right?
Yeah, so Apollo is kind of our main data API. Like this is everything we use to serve data to the front end. We're using their GraphQL kind of tools, both on the server side and the client side, to kind of deliver everything. And so in order to actually server side render, like we've got to integrate Next and Apollo to work together. And
so it's not just Next's job here, like
right.
We need data to, what would you call that, populate the front end before SSR can even do its thing.
It's kind of important to have the data.
I'd say so, sure.
Yeah. So just starting out research, obviously Googling Next.js, Apollo, like seeing what's out there. One of the first things we came across, there's some like official approaches. They've got this, Apollo has this blog post from pretty recently, March 9th, 2021, talking about getting started with Apollo client and Next.js. And
which doesn't say SSR in the title, right? Because isn't there, you could architect an app that just is like, screw it, I'm not going to do SSR at all, just client side.
Right.
And I think that's maybe, I hate to say it, but kind of the default for React.
Well, yeah, that's what we have integrated for pretty much all of the admin API. It's just fetching the data client side when the page loads, and everything renders out in React, and that it works fine. We've got plenty of areas on CodePen right now, the live site, that are all kind of client side rendered and client side fetched. And so eventually we hope to get that a little bit more integrated with using Next for server side rendering and kind of pre-fetching and pre-filling all that data.
Like when you can, right? Like some pages,
right.
Some pages, honestly, it's kind of like, who cares? Like your settings page or something. It's like, that's just client side rendered. It's never public ever. It's kind of like, who cares if that isn't. But for speed, maybe it matters. But if SEO and kind of that stuff is your main concern, it doesn't really matter. Then there's this other kind of server-side rendering that like maybe was popularized by the Jamstack model, which is like I'm going to pre-build literally every single URL into static HTML and serve that. And that's like kind of not the. Is that where you're headed with this?
Well, so that is kind of two options that Next gives you. Within Next, there's when you're creating like a page in Next.js, there's two properties you can add to it called get server side props or get static props. And they're essentially the same thing, but for different parts of kind of like the build process. Get static props is for when you run like yarn run build or whatever. Like it's going to go through all of the pages and render out like actual static HTML. And if you have that get static props property on there, it's going to handle everything in that function and then use that data that's provided to actually render out the page.
Which will be super fast, right? Because HTML is like as fast as it gets.
Right. Yeah. It's essentially just serving the raw file on the server, and that works fine. And then I think there's some advantages to using like Next to do that, because you can like hydrate the client, so like it's an actual like live React page, but delivered over the wire as like
I think it by default does that.
page.
Like you don't have any choice.
Right.
Like, yes, you're static building it, but it's still going to hydrate. Last I heard, they had some like experimental property where you could turn off client-side JavaScript, and then hey, cool, now you're not shipping any JavaScript. That's neat. But I kind of like that it ships some JavaScript generally. Because I kind of ultimately like that single page app kind of feel to things. But anyway, that's not practical for us because we have millions of users, so like we're not gonna pre-render that. That's not happening. But and of course we have the server chops to, like, for example, throw up a node server behind Next.js. So I think that's what you chase down mostly, is like, can you assume there's a literal server behind this?
Right. So that's kind of what we were focused on, is like when a page is requested, can we render that on the server before delivering it to the client for SEO, for fast loading, like just to make for a better experience. And so that's what that get server side props is for. Like whenever a page is requested and Next is actually running as a server, it runs that function or that method to actually render out the page. So it provides like the data, and you can send that through to the component that's actually going to render as like the React components in the page. You can pass through data in that way. And that's kind of what this Apollo blog post mostly focuses on for server-side rendering.
Interesting. So that GraphQL query that we're looking at right there is going to happen in Node, not in the browser.
Right. This does not run on the client. This only runs on the server, and then it passes that through to the actual like page in index.js.
Isn't that like problem solved then? Like
it's okay. So one of the issues kind of with this is, so number one, you've got to set this up at the page level. So at the very top level, you can't have it like in a sub component of that page.
Right.
And you don't have like that query as like a live query on the page. So if you wanted to like have this country's data referenced in a way that it was going to actually respond and like update on the client to like a refetch or like a page change, right, or just new data coming in, that's not going to work, because this was all just handled on the server side and passed through just as
it doesn't like hydrate. It's not that intelligent about rehydration.
Right.
So what if you want that to happen, then you have to rewrite that same exact GraphQL query again?
Right. So you're essentially duplicating that query, and then for like the client side, it's essentially getting the data from the server, like server rendered, and then it's refetching that data because it doesn't understand that the data is already there.
It has to run the query literally twice.
Right. So that's not really helping anything other than maybe like SEO. Like it's a little bit of a benefit there. And as I was digging, like I found Next.js has like an actual Apollo server and client demo that
Okay.
helps with some of this. So in their setup, so they still have like a duplicate query, but they're doing it in a mostly similar way for like the client and the server. So it
Okay. So you
actually
saved
gets
yourself
static
some
props.
typing there, I guess, you know, because you,
Yeah. And the interesting part about this though is they've solved that hydration bit. So they've got the Apollo client cache that they're extracting, and then they actually use that to like fill the client side Apollo cache. So Apollo knows that it has that data, and so it doesn't need to refetch that data to then like render the page, and then it keeps that query as like a live query and ready to go.
interesting. So for example, if the SPA has been booted up and you clicked over to a second page, that's not going to happen server side. It's only going to happen client side. The query's still ready for that, and it knows the cache is empty probably, and is happy to fetch it client
Yeah,
side.
actual like page changes. I'm not sure like how Next handles that too much, like in terms of a single page application, like navigating around. But as far as Apollo is concerned, like if you had a separate mutation elsewhere that was updating this data, Apollo would recognize that this is the same data because it's in the cache and it's got all
Yeah.
the proper IDs.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you had like pagination, like you're rendering the first page of results from the server, but then they click next or previous page or whatever, that could happen in the actual client side query. So they're not even necessarily navigating to a new Next.js page.
Okay, but this is still a page, right? So
Right.
has
So
this
this is
solved like?
still top level. So in pages like index.js, and
Mm-hmm.
it's really configured like per page. Like you have to know what query that the page is going to use like down the line. Depending on your component setup, like that may or may not be ideal. You're still having to duplicate the queries, though it's a little less than like the Apollo example. Um,
Yeah. So it's kind of asking you, hey, can you please think about all of the data on this page before you render it? Which I think some people would be like, okay, that's fine, you know. But I
yeah,
think,
and
but we have like a user card or something, and the user card, our mental model is that's where the query for the user should be, because that's
right.
where it
We
needs
kind
it.
of want all that stuff like self-contained, like in its own component with its own query. And we use Apollo to like help dedupe like not re-requesting or sending too many requests. Like it kind of batches things together where
Yeah.
possible
Like that's what
and uses the
Apollo
cache.
wants you to do.
Right.
It seems
And
like.
that works great for us. So this model, it works, but it's not really ideal because it's there's still like a lot of duplication and a lot of like pre-set up per page
Mm-hmm.
versus like components. So as I kept researching and like digging around, I found that Apollo actually has some server side methods for like rendering out a page with queries. So it's got this get data from tree method from Apollo client React SSR.
Mm.
And you essentially pass that a component that it runs through all the render trees.
Oh.
Anytime like use query is called, it essentially creates a promise and waits for that data, and then continues through the rendering after that data is available, or essentially something like that. Uh, and so the way they have it set up as well in the docs is they extract the cache from that, just like the other next example, and they pass that through to be able to be used to actually like render the page.
So it
Um,
has some smarts built in here. This tree stuff seems smart. It seems like now I don't have to think about the top level query. I can leave the queries in the components where we want them.
right, because this is just going to crawl through everything and find what's needed and fetch all
Yeah.
that data, and then you
Okay.
can pass that through for actual rendering. Um, and then I kept digging to like figure out like how get data from tree could work in Next.js, and I found a 2-year-old gist. by this user Tylerian, I guess, that had this kind of example of like using get data from tree in Next.js's document. So there's a in Next.js, you've got like the underscore app wrapper that kind of helps you do like some default setup for rendering your pages. Like if you wanted to have a header on every page, or if you wanted to set like the meta tags on every page, like you can do that in the underscore app JS file. And then the underscore document JS file is actually like controlling how the document is like rendered and served. So the app JS is kind of like everything inside the HTML tags, and then the document JS tag is kind of everything like including the HTML tags and like the actual like server request in some ways.
All right, that's confusing, but okay. So you have to use document here for whatever reason.
Right. So this essentially is helping us handle the request. So whenever the request comes through, we can kind of deal with that a little bit. So in Tylerian's example, he's got get data from tree happening here, and he's kind of intercepting like some of the Next.js rendering and all this. So like there were some complications to it, but it looked workable. And maybe this is all just related to an older version of Next. This was 2 years ago, so I kind of use this as like the starting point to kind of come up with a method that worked for us. So I've got this little mini repo here where I've integrated this in like the kind of minimal viable way. And it essentially boils down to creating a shared Apollo instance that's going to fill the cache and then reference that cache for rendering. And then we're going to render the page with get data from tree. And then we're going to pass that through to like actual Next rendering. And then we're going to extract that cache to actually render on the page. So yeah, it's a little tough, but I'll walk us through it in hopefully a way that it makes sense.
Starting here at the page level, again.
Right? So this is just a standard page. I've set up Apollo client to actually fetch from this GraphQL jobs API.
Sure.
It was just one of the public ones I could find, and so it just lists out the jobs. No, nothing fancy here. So I've got a standard query. It's just pulling that data. And
if you looked at this, you couldn't tell that you even planned to do it server side or whatever. It just looks like a normal page.
Right. And then in the app.js, I've got just a normal setup. It's initializing the Apollo client and wrapping everything in Apollo provider so that Apollo works. And I've just got this get Apollo client function that's kind of helping some of the magic happen.
This also looks very normal. Other than that, like, obviously you wrote your own little Apollo client getter here, so I assume there's some magic in there.
Yeah, which we use these kind of wrappers anyway for like, so you don't have to have the same options or like initialize everything like in this one area. Like it helps kind of group the code. So if we go over to the actual document JS, here's where things start getting interesting. So we're extending the main Apollo client because document, because we don't want to have to like actually return the HTML tag and like all that kind of stuff that the next document already provides. But we are attaching onto the constructor and this get initial props function. So the get initial props is essentially what loads or what runs every request, or like get static props call if you're rendering out the static pages. So we're doing the same kind of get Apollo client call, and this allows us to create like a shared Apollo instance. So if we look back here, I've got like a global-ish variable, scope to kind of this file. And we're creating an Apollo client stored on that and then returning that. And we can force a new one, which we're doing every request. We've got this true coming through. So every page request, it's creating a new Apollo client. It's running on with the server side mode enabled. This is something Apollo client needs. Otherwise, if it detects it's on the server, it's just gonna pass pass through. Like it's not going to do anything. And then we've got the cache that we'll later fill. So
Okay.
we initialize the Apollo client in our document. We run the get data from tree function based on what Apollo tells us this page app tree is, and we're just rendering it as normal in that way. So this Apollo client is now running through get data from tree. Every use query reference is filling up the cache and rendering out the page as normal. And then we actually, once the cache is full, we use Next regular document.getInitialProps to render the page using that same shared Apollo client. So the cache is already full. And then we render that all out for Next and pass that through just like a normal Next.js rendering. But we also extract that cache and pass that through so that we can later use that. So we've got the extracted cache here, and then we attach that to this kind of global Next data variable that you can use to set up like environment variables and all that. So the client side has access to that kind of stuff.
Right. So there could be 50 queries that happen in the tree, and it's happy to just get them all.
Right.
And do it the kind of the smart, whoever knows, however it works under the hood, Apollo way, where it dedupes and all that, right?
Right.
So you're taking advantage of the best that everybody has to offer here. It just took some doing.
Yeah. So if I refresh the page here, you can see I've got render time just showing like how long it takes to render the page. This may seem a little long, but keep in mind that's also including like actually fetching all these results from this third-party server and then returning that back. Most of that time is actually just fetching that data. And then if we view source here, we can actually see everything is rendered out. Like this is all the data from the API.
SSR proof.
Right. And all that, all these little like comment tags, that's kind of React's way of like attaching those areas to the DOM. Yeah.
Cool. So it worked.
Right.
And this is a funny example where wait, did you put the query on the card or something too? It's not a query that happens on the
no, so
level.
it is just happening at this top level, but it works at any level. Just to keep it simple though, it's listed out like that. And then I set up another page to show like the live query kind of example. So this is the refetch page example. So we've got just a normal use query. We're watching the network status so that we can tell like where this came from. So when we first render the page, we see the page, the cache was full. So it just rendered this page out from the server. It didn't have to re-render on the client. But we're extracting this refetch function from the use query. Yeah. And when you click that, it's actually going to fetch that data client side. So we refetch, we got our loading state, and then it tells us the data was fetched from the client. So we can keep our queries
things
live.
Like refresh, which is we use all the time. That's the kind of the classic, like, I don't know, a drop-down menu changed or something. So I need to run that again, but I don't want to refresh the page,
Right. Or it in a separate component, like the settings page, like you were talking about. If you change your setting in one area, like other areas may need to be aware of that setting. So by keeping that live, Apollo is going to reference the cache and re-render the appropriate areas on the client. Right. Even though it was also rendered from the server.
That's kind of a good, reason why we don't regret picking Apollos, because they have those, right. Even though it can be complicated, they have those. They have reactive variables, they have client-side state, they have all this stuff that's like, yeah, turns out we actually do need all that stuff. Pretty cool. So that tree thing. So, I mean, what's your analysis so far here? Is it kind of like, I wish this was easier?
Well, so I tweeted out about this just to, make sure I was on the right track, make sure that this would actually work. I wasn't just seeing some kind of weird results. I got some feedback from Next devs and Apollo devs saying that yeah, this does work, but it's not recommended. And the reason they don't recommend it is because like depending on how you have your queries set up, like that, this can require like a lot of rendering on the server. For example, if you've got like a conditionally rendered component that's based on other data from another query, once that first query fetches, then the page is now re-rendering and that new query shows up. So the server goes back through and waits for that data to render and then comes back through. So like you can get into some long render times. But my kind of solution for that, if we go back to our Apollo initialization, you can actually set up default options for queries. So in our Apollo client, there's a default options object for watch query and query. We can say SSR false. For every query, you can enable or disable it for server-side rendering. So if we go ahead and save that and go back to our simple page, let's see, actually on the refresh page, we refresh this. Let's see. Did I do it? Yeah, I'm not sure. I may have that.
You're saying server-side rendering shouldn't be. It should not.
Right. This should disable the server-side rendering for all the queries. Something else is going on there, but the idea there is the queries that you do actually want to run on the server for like the essential page data for whatever, you could go back in and in the use query options there, you can set up SSR true. And so this allows you to control exactly which queries are going to run and on the server versus which will run on the client. But you're using the same kind of render method. You're not duplicating queries. You're not duplicating all this stuff. And this also has the advantage of if you do that in like one area and somewhere else is using that same query data, it'll pull it from the cache and render what it can. So you end up, you can just enable certain queries that have the essential data, and then the page will render out and get you.
Okay. So how does it like? What if you did it 50-50? Half of them are SSR and half of them aren't. It'll just attempt to build as much of the page as it can, and
right, it'll render out as much of the page as it can. Other components with like this loading, like if you did a loading check or like if there's data available check, it'll render out that on the server side, and then the client side will try to actually fetch that query and render it.
Well, that seems pretty cool, right? So if you turn this into some slow, if the server seems to be doing too much work, which I don't know how you would know, you'd just feel it probably or look at some charts.
There's ways to measure it. Like Vercel has a lot of Next like measuring tools for measuring the performance of your server and all that kind of stuff.
So you just chill out on the server side stuff if it seemed to matter, right? Like some pages you kind of like, not that you totally don't care, but you might not care a ton, like our admin tools or what's funny that you tested out on our admin tools. It's kind of like our admin tools don't need any server side rendering at all. Like, whatever,
right. Yeah. We were just using that as like a base for, we have this GraphQL API and we want to try server side rendering. So
right. But if we were to use this for the pen editor or something, then we care about every possible metric there is to care about,
Right. And in those instances, like that's where the SEO is really important. Like we want the main like details of the pin to load, like the user who owns it, like that, those kind of basic details of it. And the rest of the data can actually load on the client. But if we can get those like SEO key bits rendered out and also make the page load really fast, like that's going to be
pretty really sweet. Helpful. And so the developer ergonomics for this then are just like, does this feel like really critical to me to be there before the client runs? Like, then put SSR2 on it. And if you don't care, then just leave it off.
Right. Right. And so, yeah, it just makes it really easy to control what's server-side rendered and what's not, by disabling everything by default and then selectively enabling it where you actually want it.
Yeah. So I don't know. It's a little tough to imagine how much easier it could be. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe a little more magic or something, but
yeah, it's a little bit of setup with like the Apollo thing, like, just recognizing that you're trying to like share an Apollo instance. And I tried to do it in a way where you're not having to like pass that down as a prop. Like that was one of the ways, like the Tylerian example, he's like passing it through as a prop and like trying to use it there. And like, it just gets a little difficult to manage, but by doing it this way and just having this one function to kind of pass the shared Apollo client or create a new one around, then that simplifies it a bit. But all this document stuff is weird.
I'm sure even that cache stuff, it's like you have to know about the cache, and I don't know. I don't know what to say about that other than like I never cherish having to manually think about cache.
Yeah, Apollo does a really good job overall with it, but there's plenty of times where we have to manually manipulate the cache for optimistic responses and different things like that on CodePen, just to make the user experience as smooth as possible. Mm-hmm. This was a relatively simple use of the cache compared to some of the other gymnastics we've pulled.
All right. Well, that was great. Hopefully we can, I don't know.
This repo will kind of walk through everything. There's lots of comments in there that you may not have been able to catch on the video, but it kind of walks through the whole process and hopefully makes that make sense. But file an issue or start a conversation. What is the
7 stars already? This is smoking.
I'm popular. Yeah, great. So but that's basically it.
This episode of CodePen Radio on TV was brought to you by Retool. Retool.com/startups is a new little program they have to kind of hook you up. If you're a startup, you should know about this. They learned after working with thousands of startups and technical founders that they spend a ton of time building internal tools. Tell me about it. We've totally done this at CodePen a lot. It means that you're spending more time doing that than you are on your core product, which is obviously not a good thing. This Retool for Startups is a program to give you access to a lot of the software that you need to build great internal tooling, but faster, like 10 times faster, meaning, dashboards to check stuff out, CRUD apps for, changing and replicating data really easy, things that early stage startups totally need. So they bundled together all the free access to these tools, including Retool itself. It's $160,000 worth of discounts to save you money while you're building with all the software that you need, like AWS, MongoDB, Brex, Segment, super popular, super powerful stuff. So use the credits to, build a product dashboard, a billing data view, convert some manual workflow into a digital workflow, so that your team is more efficient. Help build tools for non-technical teammates, like a little CMS kind of thing to control content. All that type of stuff is possible with Retool and other services that you'll, basically be getting for free here because of this awesome program. So go apply at retool.com/startup.